All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for the second day of the University of Minnesota Climate Resilience Pollinator Habitats Across Minnesota Landscapes webinar series. So today is the second session of a four-part series, and Karin Jokela will be speaking on pollinators in our shifting climate, making an impact on the farm. So joining us here today is Quincy Sadowski as part of our team. She's in Stearns, Benton, Morrison, and Sherburne counties, local extension educator. We also have Claire LeCan, who is an extension educator in crops, who specializes more in the entomology and integrated pest management. We have Elaine Evans, extension educator and researcher, working on pollinator education and conservation, and Aaron Loeffler. Oh, Aaron and Andy also joining us, two speakers that will be later on in the week. And also myself, I forgot to introduce myself yesterday. So hi, I'm Terry Young. I'm a local extension educator in Hubbard County. So we have an awesome team of people, as you probably noticed yesterday if you joined us, but I'm very grateful for everyone's help. So just as a refresher, I'd like to go over how we can all engage with each other in this Zoom webinar format. So please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. I'll be asking Karin questions only from that section. So for any comments, you can use the chat feature. And if you kind of noticed yesterday, we had a lot of chat going on. So if you ever find that to be distracting, you can always use the little up arrow or the little caret to press on that, and then you can use that to say unselect show chat preview, and that will allow you to focus on Karin's presentation. So as a reminder, all of these presentations will be recorded, and I'll be emailing those recordings out on Friday. I'll also include all the links that will be shared during this presentation in that email, so don't worry if you don't catch them all. Now, on to Karin and her presentation. Karin is a Pollinator Conservation Specialist / NRCS Partner Biologist for the Xerces Society. Karin provides pollinator-related technical support and training to NRCS field office conservation planners and farmers in Minnesota and western Wisconsin. For a decade, she has worked with landowners to design, implement, and evaluate habitat restoration efforts across many land uses in the upper Midwest. Karin also manages a small native plant nursery on her and her husband's organic vegetable farm. Well, awesome, Karin. We're ready for you.
Thank you. I am also excited to be here, and I'm just surprised and amazed that there are so many people here and interested in this topic. So thanks for your participation, because I think this will be fun. Not only this series, but like what comes out of it. So I will start with this really briefly just to say, like, this is the title, Pollination and Climate Change, but really what I mean is, like, how are we going to support biodiversity in agroecosystems through a changing climate in the Midwest? That's what we're going to talk about today. Before I get into any of that content, though, I would like to introduce the Xerces Society, the organization that I work for, just in case there's anybody here who hasn't heard of us. We are a nonprofit wildlife conservation organization. We work to protect invertebrates and their habitats. We take our name from the Xerces blue butterfly, the first butterfly to go extinct due to human-influenced habitat loss. So we really started as a butterfly conservation organization, and then in the last over 50 years have expanded our scope to include protection and advocacy and habitat work for all things without a backbone. And this is not a Xerces blue butterfly. This is a Karner blue butterfly that is endangered, but is kind of it's very similar to Xerces blue butterfly in the way it appears in some ways, and also sort of something that resonates more with the Midwestern landscape. We work with lots of partners, scientists, community partners to really follow the most current research on the habitat work that we're doing. We have a variety of program areas. Our largest program area is Pollinators and Agricultural Biodiversity. That's the program that houses me and a lot of my coworkers, but we also do a lot of other work with endangered species. Sometimes that overlaps with pollinator program. We have this really amazing, clear-eyed group of folks who focus on how to reduce pesticides in the environment, and they really support the rest of the program areas. We just do a lot of stuff that's really needed. And we don't do this work alone. So I always like to start presentations by acknowledging those of you in the room who might be members of the Xerces Society and who are really critical for the work we do. That's a huge source of our funding and allows us to do some flexible stuff where we sometimes don't have funding otherwise. We also work with lots of partners, and researchers like Jeremy yesterday, and or like agency staff like the next couple speakers. So can't do this work in isolation. And donors really do make it possible. If you're not a donor yet and you like what you hear today, I would encourage you to consider becoming a member. When you become a member, you get a gift, kind of like public radio. This is one of the potential gifts to get. We just like this habitat sign. We just came out with a new sign, this pesticide-free sign, that could be a gift with your donation. When you become a member, you also are automatically subscribed to these newsletters or these small magazines that help you see the world of invertebrate conservation, get to know these animals and all their cool idiosyncrasies, and maybe help them feel more relatable and understand the conservation work we do. Okay, I also wanted to say a little bit about the role I play with Xerces. I've been with Xerces for almost 8 years in this role as a pollinator conservation specialist and a partner biologist with the NRCS. That's the Natural Resources Conservation Service. It's the branch of the USDA that helps farmers with all things related to conservation. And so I support the conservation staff who work across the state in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and their audience. So these are conservationists who work in in county offices who, are helping farmers with soil erosion, with forest resource concerns, with who want to create prairie, who have pest problems. So I support all of that through training, through technical document writing, habitat evaluations, a lot of field days, and that kind of thing. Tara already mentioned it, but I thought I might also just say that I wear a lot of hats, and I don't usually do this in professional presentations, but I also don't usually go do this deep dive into climate change in presentations. And as I was building out this content, I realized that I really have a stake in this as a farmer, as somebody who has kids. I realized we all kind of have this really maybe emotional stake in this. And maybe I just felt for the sake of transparency and just bringing my whole person to this presentation that I would share that, yeah, I have some practical experience farming. I worry a lot about what that farm future will look like. And so I just wanted, and also just for practical reasons, I think there's going to be a lot of parts of this presentation where I'm going to be referencing little things that we tried on our farm. And so it's just easier for me to say that I also wear those hats. Okay, so the whole premise of this talk is going to be this central tenet. So if there's nothing else you take away from the talk today, I want you to remember that biodiversity conservation is intrinsically linked with climate adaptation. That is something that I take for granted probably, but I hope to mention it many times today. These are some of the things that I'm going to go through. First, I'm going to start with this idea of what is biodiversity conservation. We're going to talk about who the critters are that help us in agriculture, what the threats are to them in the current landscape and the projected future climate, and then a bunch of creative nature-based solutions. And I have like on the farm in quotes, sort of, because I'm going to at that term a little bit later. But that's kind of the roadmap where we're headed today. So this is what Xerces really believes, that biodiversity and climate change are inherently, intrinsically linked together. The solutions for one are the solutions for the other. And fundamentally, put another way, biodiversity underpins global nutrition, global food security, all of our agricultural systems. But I thought I would define our terms a little bit here, and talk about like what do I really mean by biodiversity conservation, and what is biodiversity anyway? How many species are there on this planet? Some of the most recent literature is citing that we think there might be 8.7 million species on the earth. A lot of those are undescribed yet. But the ones that are described, we have about 2.1 million species. This doesn't include a lot of microorganisms. Of that chunk of 2.1 million, a huge proportion of that biodiversity is invertebrates, represented by invertebrate species. That's 70%. So that's why I have a huge ant, kind of like proportionally about 70% of the biodiversity, right? And then, another 20% of the biodiversity in terms of number of species or richness that we have out there is represented by plants. And a very small fraction of biodiversity that's named and described on this planet are things with a backbone. So vertebrates, things that get all the conservation attention, tigers, frogs, birds, so forth. And sadly, many of these species will go extinct before we ever described them or learned about their gifts or what they were doing here on this earth. And then this reality has been becoming more and more present in my life. I've been reading a lot by the author and ecologist Rob Dunn, partly because I'm scheduled to speak with him at the Marvel Seed Organic Farming Conference. And while reading one of his books, The Natural History of the Future, he cited this literature showing that there's actually all this microbial diversity out there that we don't know really anything about. And it blew my mind as somebody who frequently tells people that invertebrates run the world. And I just wanted to share what all of this means. So I just made this yellow kind of pie chart graph, and that little white line is indicating like the 2.1 million species that we that we know and have described, or maybe I should say that we've described. We don't really know all that much about those species yet. That's swimming in this world of undescribed microbial species that we really hardly know how they're interacting with us on our microbiomes, in our bodies, on plants, in the air we breathe, the microbes I'm sitting on right now. So that has been really humbling for me. I'm always here for a little dose of humility. And in this book, Rob suggests this daily affirmation to say that I am large in a world of small species. I am multicellular in a world of single-celled species. I am named in a world of nameless species. Most of what is knowable is not yet known. Okay, so this is the biodiversity that lives on Earth. Here's another way of thinking about that biodiversity. This is just biomass of that biodiversity. You can see, and this the common metric here is tons of carbon. Carbon is common building block of life. So you can see there's a large proportion of the biomass on Earth is represented by plants. Then there's, the next several columns there on the right are all what we would consider microorganisms, those things we don't really see, but they're actually creating a lot of biomass on Earth. Then there's this tiny little corner here, which is the animal life, right? The animal biomass. So I did blow that up so you can see what's in there. A small portion of that is humans. A lot of that is still invertebrates, the arthropods, annelids, mollusks, that kind of thing. Nematodes, very, very small percentage is actually wild animals. So that's humbling too. So the reason I'm explaining all this is that I think these are hidden, this is hidden biodiversity that we need to also harness when we think about changes to climate. And also not ignore that there's a lot of things out there that could be really creating mutualisms and beneficial for us that we still have yet to explore. The soil health movement actually has really been leaders in all the people who participate in soil health, leaders in recognizing the value of this microbial diversity and what it brings to ecosystem function. It's commonly said that a teaspoon of soil contains more living organisms than all people on Earth. That's pretty humbling, you know, thinking about a bowl of cereal, all those microorganisms that could be in the soil. Several thousand different taxa, billions of bacterial cells, and so forth. And I suspect that these microorganisms are not just critical for soil health, but they're also critical for so many other ecosystem functions. And this is where I usually start talks, right? Like, I'm not a microbial biologist or ecologist. I really don't know that much about them. None of us really do, I think. This is where I typically start, which is like, these are the small things that most of us are still not paying attention to, but at least you can see them with a naked eye, right? And we at Xerces are constantly trying to remind people that the fate of these insects is really inseparable from our own fate, because these are animals that are out around the earth doing important things like nutrient cycling and decomposition. They're offering free pest control services. They're doing that service of turning plant material into little protein packages for other animals to eat. And of course, they're pollinating our plants. Not our plants, but plants on Earth. Many of them we like to consume. And so therefore it's a valuable service. And I'm going to explain here that many of you may know this already about me, but even though I'm a pollinator conservation specialist and I'm trying to explain the value of pollinators, I am often trying to slip in the value of all these other insects that come along with pollinator habitat and pollinator conservation. And that's not to say, like, pollinators are very, very important, but it's also, I want all the rest of the critters to come too. Right? So pollinators are really important for ecological processes. We would consider them keystone species or a keystone group. And what that means is that they're playing a disproportionate role in maintaining balance in an ecosystem. It's sort of like a disproportionate impact on the rest of what's happening in the habitat. 85% or more of flowering plants are dependent on these animals. Usually those animal pollinators are insects. Usually those insects are bees. But I also am very aware of the fact that pollinators are really important flagship species, sort of like ambassadors for the rest of the insects that sometimes people are a little uncomfortable with. They're charismatic, they attract a lot of public attention, they are really good for just metaphors about pollination. And so that's also a way I'm going to be talking about pollinator conservation. And I also want you to know, like, when I talk about pollinator conservation, it's implied that I'm talking about all this other biodiversity. Okay, so now this is the part where we start to get into the services and how pollinators and biodiversity are key partners on farms. These are the kinds of slides I would use to kind of persuade a farmer about how cool insects are. And the first is that pollinators forage on our crops and in the natural areas around our crops, both of which I really like. I'm glad that they're pollinating flowers because not just in my natural areas, because those things give me joy. Those things have medicines to other animals. But I also am really glad that they pollinate all these vegetable crops that I consume. And if this were a live audience, I would be asking which of these plants is pollinator dependent. But since I can't really interact with you that way, I'll just show you the answer, which is that most of them are pollinator dependent. There are a few crops in here, the sweet potatoes, the potatoes that you could propagate through other propagules, like a tuber or something. You don't necessarily need a seed that was pollinated by a bee or insect. But everything else would be thanks to a pollinator. And even though this image just shows like one cartoonish type of pollinator, we know that these are actually many different kinds of pollinators that are responsible for these seeds. And I would just, you know, as a farmer, this is one of those instances where I want to explain a little anecdote from the farm, which is that sometimes cultivated crops can even be better for pollinators, or at least more preferred in some cases than things that I would presume, like are higher value flowering habitat crops. So here's an example of a year, this was in 2019, when I planted a whole bunch of different flowering cover crop trials on the farm so that I could monitor them in a pretty formal way to try to figure out which pollinators were visiting so that I could better understand how to give recommendations for the farmers I work with. So I was out there in August, actually this might have been July, monitoring for which insects were visiting the the sunflower field, and it felt very quiet in that field, even though there was flowers open, there was pollen and nectar available. But then I walked down the field road and realized that this field of hot peppers was just alive and buzzing. And when I went through and scouted it out, there were bumblebees everywhere. And I realized that, this was the more preferred resource, even though there was abundant flowers in both. And I showcase this for a couple of reasons. One is that I think there's this notion that a lot of us, especially gardeners, feel like I'm going to plant this pollinator habitat over there for the wildlife. And then I'm going to plant my vegetable crops over here for me. And I think that there's a lot more blurriness here, that we should, these pollinators are here for all of it, right? And we are integrated in that as well. And I also just love thinking about all of the bumblebee babies that are being raised on hot pepper pollen. Anyway, so crops are important for pollinators too. Okay, and as we know from Jeremy's talk yesterday, that the more pollinators we have in a plant community, the more reliable we can get pollination services. And this is borne out in research that when we have more diverse pollinators, we get higher pollination and therefore higher yields. And that's because of different body shapes, functions, the way these animals are carrying pollen, the way they shake pollen off different crops and store it on their bodies. Some of that is thanks to like buzz pollination or sonification. Sonication? One of you bumblebee experts can correct me in the chat. Anyway, this is just a case for higher diversity of pollinators. When we create habitat on the farm, we bring them in all this other natural pest control. This is sort of the uglier side, the part that I don't always share with every audience, but farmers appreciate this. This is sometimes what they want even more than the pollinator habitat. They want help with pest control. And these other insects are coming along for the ride and doing just that. Because most of the bugs on the farm, if we invite them, they're doing beneficial things. They're eating pests, they're eating weed seeds, they're at different parts of their life cycle, they're predators of this or that pest. They're doing a lot of interesting things. Sometimes we don't see the stage where they're being a predator because they're kind of cryptic. Like in the example in the center, like that's that little green thing that I would hardly even notice. That is a syrphid fly larva, voracious predator of aphids. And then as an adult, it visits flowers and can be quite a accomplished pollinator. Like it's very important for pollination. And so a lot of our natural enemies are using habitat for some part of their life cycle, and then they're visiting crops to eat pests and other things during a different part of their life cycle. Invertebrates contribute to soil health, as I already alluded to. These are animals that are creating nutrient movement from that top layer where there's a lot of decay and decomposition and moving it down into deeper parts of the soil. In that process, they're allowing roots to grow in those channels for air infiltration, water infiltration. They're moving all these other microorganisms with them in the process, and all of this is creating better fertility and soil health. Here's another illustration of how that works. I really love learning more about microorganisms because it just blows my mind. So here's a diagram. If you look on the left, you can see this whole big circle on the outside is like the diameter of one coarse sand grain, right? Right, you can see kind of, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the right below that, you can see kind of the diameters of silt, clay, and the medium sand, fine sand, and I'm moving left here, fine sand, very fine sand. So that's kind of just your scale, right? And then you've got these other kinds of microorganisms you can't see, these tiny bacteria and organisms like mites that are still quite small, right? They're carrying that bacteria on their bodies, inside their bodies. Things that go inside their body and out are moving that bacteria through the system. And they're moving around. These are mites you might consider like mesofauna. You can see them with your naked eye, but kind of just barely. A lot of them hitch a ride on larger organisms, macrofauna, like this burying beetle, hitch a ride into deeper parts of the soil, and they bring all those microorganisms, that bacteria with them. So anyway, this is happening probably not just in the soil, but in all parts of our ecosystems. Biodiversity on the farm supports food webs. These are just fun, kind of on the right. A lot of you are probably already familiar with things like kind of the work of Doug Tallamy. But his research showing that these songbirds that all of us adore are really dependent on insects. One breeding pair can need up to 6,000 to 9,000 different caterpillars, and those are small birds, right? Think about all the other birds that we care about. They need food in the landscape, and that food is invertebrates. Nursing bats probably aren't eating 4,000 large katydids like this a night, but they're probably eating a lot of insects. And then, you know, from my part, there's this whole idea of the extinction of experience that really matters a lot to me, and the fact that insects are so accessible and they're right there in all of our backyards, ideally, and that those encounters are free and they offer so much joy and curiosity and humility. And that's really important for me. So it's not just these services that they provide to a farmer like me, but also they bring meaning to life, right? So that is the part, you know, that's kind of like that package of kind of like making the case for invertebrates as partners to farmers, right? And I'm like scanning all of my screens to do a time check because I I have an irresponsible number of slides in here. I think I'm okay. All right, so these are our partners, right? They're doing things for us, but we as farmers and as concerned, you know, community members can do a lot to support them as well. But there are a lot of threats. This is a figure that should look familiar if you tuned in yesterday to Jeremy's talk. It's a commonly used figure to talk about insect declines and all the different factors that contribute to their global decline. I am not going to go into all of these in great detail, but what I will do is talk about kind of a cluster of them that relate to climate change, particularly like the global warming, storm intensity, that kind of thing. This cluster that related to agricultural intensification and the pesticides that we use on those farms, and that's sort of related to pollution. So I am going to go through some of these, talk about the threats so that we can better understand what the solutions might be. So climate change in the Midwest, these are just, this is again a little bit review from yesterday, but it's worth repeating, that we're projected to see a lot of changes. The worst case scenario models, status quo models show that by the end of the century, we'll be seeing hotter weather, 10 degrees hotter potentially. We'll have potentially higher, drier summers, wetter spring and falls, and more intense precipitation events when we get that precipitation. There's going to be increased variability, therefore decreased predictability. There's going to be these spikes of weather, and all of these stressors are going to interact with other things and get amplified, like pesticides and landscape simplification and things like that. So I'm just going to show a couple maps to give a quick picture of what the climate projections are going to look like and how they relate to farming in the state. This is where I regret that I didn't partner with one of you from Extension, because all of you are way more fluent in this than I am. I'll do my best here. If any of you have questions about climate forecasting, our Extension staff are the place to go. I'll do my best. So on the left, what I'm showing here are days per year of that are 90 degrees or hotter. And historically, we didn't have too many. But by mid-century, by 2040 to 2060, possibly 15 years away, in the high emission scenario, we could be seeing a lot of hot days, which are obviously going to impact us. It's going to impact the crops we grow. It's going to impact the pollinators and all of our interactions. The precipitation changes that we're projected to see really do matter a lot for growing system like agriculture in the state. And speaking from experience, so in the spring, we're expected to see greater percentage of precipitation. And again, that precipitation might come in like big pulses. Um, Getting a lot of water in the spring is not good for planting. It's hard to get into the field. It's harder to get the plants established that might be coming up from seed or small little seedlings. It is a great way to spread disease with those little seedlings and potentially harmful disease, not just to the plants, but also to us. It's also a really difficult time to get on top of like initial weed control. So that initial weed control, if you don't get on top of it right away, it has impacts later in this growing season. And in the fall as well, if we're expected to see more precipitation in the fall, that's going to impact harvest, getting into the field for harvest. It's really helpful to harvest crops when they're dry and not wet for storage. For also when we're harvesting things, we want to be able to get some kind of cover on the soil so that we're not leaving the soil exposed over winter. So there's just lots of challenges with these projections for precipitation. And I am just going to say, underline again, that extension is the place to go. I'm not even going to name names because there's so many excellent extension staff that I don't want to forget anybody. But these are the experts. They are excellent humans and very knowledgeable. And if you're a farmer, particularly, or even a gardener, they have great resources for gardeners. Visit them and their resources for climate interactions. I also want to just bring this kind of bigger picture question about agriculture into this conversation. In 2020, a paper was published where a bunch of researchers came together to kind of model the human niche over the last 6,000 years. And what they found is that actually, just like other taxa, you find these little climate niches that are their like ideal conditions for thriving, that actually humans are really, they show strong preferences for certain kind of temperature niches in particular. And this is the temperature niche today, these like preferred zones for living. You can see this temperate zone in the kind of southern United States, central California, and so forth. And then they showed, with these changes that we're expected to see in climate and temperature changes, where that niche, that human niche, might shift on the surface of the Earth, which is quite alarming to see this mapped out. And actually, the paper that was published shows global maps for this, if you want to go see the global maps. But this indicates there could be massive upheavals in like where we're living, where we're growing food. Down in southern parts of the range are going to be very hot and not really allow for thriving human conditions or crop production there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that people will move. In fact, people are kind of showing opposite behavior. So I don't know what honestly to make of this exactly, except for that I live in Minnesota and I want to make sure that if and when more people arrive in our region, that we have stable and diverse and productive systems to minimize the stress on all of us, because migration is stressful for those who leave and for those who receive and interact. Okay. Climate change effects on pollinators. This is sort of a review from yesterday too, but I just want to distill it down. because they are also experiencing all these temperature changes, which affects their physiology. As Jeremy explained yesterday, that could result in range shifts, moving either to higher altitudes or higher latitudes. When they're trying to move, if they're trying to move, they're going to need habitat to move through in order to be successful and find a more appropriate climate niche for them. There's going to be all these disruptions and changes of phenology, mismatches between the pollinators and the plants that they used to depend on. This is especially going to be true for early season species. And that's going to have effects on plants. Plants are going to be affected independently on other, the temperatures, the drought, that's going to affect pollinators. All of these, all of these effects are related and they interact and they get amplified, they synergize. And then they are even bigger and more amplified when you add in things like stressors like pesticides. One thing that I think is really interesting when you think about humans, you think about all these other animals and plants that need to move in the landscape to more preferable climate niches, is that we're all going to experience these novel interactions of new things that we haven't encountered in our environment before. Microbes, predators, disease, competitors, all these different things. That is going to be stressful. So that for pollinators as well. So who's the most vulnerable here? Before I even go into this content, the first thing I want to say is that these are all figures and content from Heather Holm, who is a really excellent local biologist, researcher, speaker, advocate for pollinators. And if you're not already familiar with her work, I suggest you go find her resources, Heather Holm. So I'm just prefacing that to say that this figure and these photos are all hers. But the content, who's most vulnerable, this is just general knowledge. So specialist species, those species that for a long time have come to specialize in a certain environmental niche, a certain kind of plant species. Over time, they've been able to do that through like climate stability. Those are the species that are likely to be vulnerable in these unpredictable situations. Predictability is going to be a thing of the past, basically. So those specialist species could really be challenged. Species that are already in decline, so like the rusty patch bumblebee is already in decline, it's likely to not do as well, even though it's sort of a generalist species. So maybe I should explain the figure on the right. So what I'm showing here is at the top of the figure, there's the word narrow, at the bottom there's broad. So this is a spectrum of diet preferences or pickiness for bees and their pollen specialization. So at the top, they would specialize in collecting pollen from maybe one plant genus. That would be extreme kind of pickiness or monolecty. All the way down to polylecty, which is where they are collecting plant or pollen from many different plant resources over time. So anyway, some species will be declining. Species that are already declining are likely to not fare well. Species that occur at high altitudes are likely to not do well because there's nowhere else to go if they're already up there. And then species with already small ranges in a world with fragmentation and a lot of shifts, that's likely to be challenging for them to do well. So I'm still in this threats section, right? So we talked about some of the climate changes. We talked about some of the preferences and the biology of insects that might make it challenging to adapt to climate changes. And then the other third factor that I really want to talk about is this widespread pesticide contamination that's just going to underlie all these other stresses because pesticide contamination is ubiquitous. It's kind of in the environment everywhere. Pesticides that we apply in one place rarely stay there. I didn't put all the references in here, but if you were to type in Arctic snow and pesticides, rainfall and pesticides, you'd be able to find the research citations for all of these. So how are pollinators exposed to pesticides? There's a number of different ways. Through direct contact, they could be actually sprayed with a pesticide. They could pick up nest materials that are contaminated. You can see all these different ways that they arrive or handle material that's contaminated. One of the ways that they interact with pesticides more and more in the last 20 years is through handling materials from plants that have been treated with a systemic insecticide. And so I'm going to get into the systemic stuff in a second here, but what I want to help you understand is relative risks of different pesticides in the environment. A risk is really a calculation of like how acutely harmful is a certain pesticide to a honeybee in particular, and then multiply that times like how often do they encounter that pesticide and other things in the environment over time, like how frequently are they seeing it, how much of it are they getting. Together that equals kind of the risk of what's in the environment. So systemic insecticides, where do we find them? Pretty much everywhere. This is, there are neonicotinoids are one of the systemic insecticides. There are others, but we're seeing them not just in crop production, but really in urban environments a lot. Nursery production, lawns, urban trees. I'll go into some of those details in a second here. In general, we're just seeing like higher rates of these this class of insecticides used on all kinds of different crops in the last 20 years. And these are concerning because they're highly toxic to bees. So that's that acute toxicity, right? And then they're getting repeat exposure to these pesticides because they're persistent in the environment and they're used ubiquitously and they're systemic. So they're hanging out kind of in the environment. There's increased toxic load for pollinators as well in the last 20 years. Some people will argue, people who want to still be able to use different pesticides will argue that overall volume has gone down. That's not reflected in this figure. But what I am showing here is the increased toxic load for pollinators. And that's a calculation based on the total amount of insecticides used, the contact, like toxicity, and the environmental persistence. So you can see that neonicotinoids have really increased over time. And 2014, you'll see is the last year on this chart, because that is the last year for which seed treatments were reported. There's sort of this loophole in pesticide regulation that doesn't require seed treatments to be tracked and reported in the same way as other kinds of pesticides that are applied. So that is why we don't know how much has been applied in the last 20 years or 10 years. But there are real risks. A lot of them are arriving on a seed treatment, as you can kind of see these colorful corn pieces on the far right. They're not that effective in terms of they're sort of over applied because a lot of the material actually ends up in other parts of the environment, not on the crop or in the crop. 2 to 3% of the application actually does have yield benefits or have, some crop benefits. In other words, they're used by the plant. Some of it's lost through dust. A lot of it runs off. These are highly mobile, water-soluble kinds of insecticides that move through the environment, stay in the environment, take a while to break down, and impact all those invertebrates that I was describing earlier on that make up the fabric of the earth. So those are some real important risks for our agricultural landscapes and biodiversity protection in the upper Midwest. All of this is on top of other interacting stressors. A lot of those seed treatments also carry fungicides, and fungicide exposure, while it isn't intended to kill fungi, can still impact bees and pollinators. As this figure really nicely illustrates, there's some, like that microbiome, right? It can impact the gut microbiome, and that also interacts with other stressors like poor nutrition, a disease load already, lower immune response, right? So this is occurring with fungicides. I'm showing you a fact sheet that we have that's multiple pages long, goes through some of the science on fungicide impacts on pollinators. Similarly, we also have a rather new publication about herbicide impacts, and how we might think about strategic ways to use herbicides in ways that will minimize harm to pollinators. Because herbicides can also impact that gut microbiome, alter behavior, and over time kind of reduce population strength. So as a general rule, that was a lot of stuff about pesticides. You might be thinking, why did I stress that? But I really do think that's going to make all of the climate impacts more stressful if we don't address kind of these ubiquitous biocides in our environment. So at Xerces, we really focus on trying to help farmers find preventative measures rather than reactive approaches to pest management. And one of the ways that we really underline is to use biodiversity to our advantage. And this is not a new idea. This is something that some of you are probably very familiar with, this quote from Aldo Leopold, but basically, like, if the biota in the course of eons has built something we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? The most important thing that you probably have heard before is this idea of to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And so as the more I learn about the microbes on this earth and how important they probably are, the more I want to be careful about using widespread biocides, especially in our ecosystems or our agroecosystems that are going to support our own sustainability. All right, so that was a little depressing. I know the threat section is depressing, but it's important to kind of understand. But we can make changes collectively, and we need all of you. We need more science. We need to take action now. We can work to create habitat, protect existing habitat, share this enthusiasm for habitat with each other, and talk to our political leaders about the importance of habitat. So at Xerces, we work a lot with farmers, and like one of our largest programs is the biodiversity, Pollinator Conservation and Biodiversity Protection Program. So this is what our work often looks like. But I just want to start this section about like what are our solutions and what does it look like on a farm by expanding this notion of like what is a farm, because as you saw earlier, we're going to have all this potential migration with a lot of changes, and maybe we should start thinking about more sources of food that are nearby where we live. And so there are a lot of people doing this. Urban agriculture is also not necessarily something new, but I just want to draw attention to it. This is an example of a half-acre farm in the Bronx, where they're doing a lot of important food education and environmental education and community building. We are also working on similar kind of efforts in North Minneapolis and other parts of the metro, where these are spaces where they're not going to solve food security, but they're really important places for showcasing that flagship part of understanding like what habitat is, how it interacts with the food crops that we depend on, what are the mutualisms there, and amplifying kind of the work that we need to do. So I wanted to start with a couple images of kind of urban ag, partly because I recognize that a lot of the other images I'm going to show you are in the more stereotypical kind of rural farm setting, but I really think we're going to need farm and agro ecosystems kind of like all over the map, in urban dense populations and in rural areas. So if we're going to create habitat or any kind of like life supporting agroecosystems, these are 3 requirements that we need for insects. There's food, and sometimes that's eating other insects. Sometimes that's eating certain plant materials like pollen or leaf material. Animals like this need shelter, a place to overwinter. And sometimes that's above ground, sometimes that's below ground, and of course they need refuge from all kinds of pesticides. So what I'm going to do is go through each one of these and how it might look like, what the solutions might look like on the farm. And so I'm going to start with pesticides, partly because it's fresh on your mind. And and then we'll go through shelter and nesting and then the food stuff. Okay. So pesticides and habitat, I see a lot of folks trying to create habitat right next to places that um, have a lot of risk for pollinators. And so field margins are often going to be, especially catchment areas that are downslope, are often going to be places that have higher contaminants. So those are places to think carefully about. But I also, just with this theme of trying to think about not just these rural landscapes, but also that pesticides are in our environments all over, in urban areas too. So when we're creating habitat and agroecosystems in urban areas, I wanted to highlight a few other resources that Xerces has that are also talking about how to do integrated pest management and healthy kind of ecological pest management in urban areas. So one is this one, smarter pest management at home. Here's another one, responding to insects and diseases on landscape trees and shrubs. So these can be trees that we are foraging off of in the cities that often get treated with neonicotinoids. So this is another fact sheet that we recently developed that offers some alternative solutions. And then where we acquire our plants that we want for habitat or for consumption, we should be trying to press the nursery industry as well to be producing plants that are safe for us and for bees. Okay. Pesticides impact insects in the environment in different ways based on that insect's kind of natural history. So an insect like a monarch actually hedges its bets across the landscape, laying one egg here, one egg there, and then they nest somewhere else, right? But a lot of smaller insects might just nest in the soil on this slope and then go pollinate the blueberries down in that field and only ever travel within like a couple 100 meters. So all of these are going to be impacted by pesticides in the environment in different ways. So when we create habitat on farms, we're trying to do it in the most strategic place possible. And I apologize to my farmer friend for taking this photo during the fall when the flowering habitat is like not showy. But you can see here, there's this conventional crops kind of on the left behind this windbreak. Then there's this non-flowering buffer that's protecting the organic blueberries and the habitat, buffering it from some of the pesticides that might be coming in. So that's what we would consider strategic, thoughtful habitat placement. Pollinators also need nest protection. So remember, they needed the three things. They needed pest protection or pesticide protection, nest protection, and food. So here we're getting into nest protection. Pollinators mostly nest in the ground. Some of them nest above ground in wood or stems in various places. They need nest protection to thrive. Sometimes that can look on a farm. I forgot I put this one in. This is a kind of a silly example. I don't know if I should go through the details of this, but innovative ways to reduce tillage on a farm. Yeah, the bottom line is that a principle for conserving pollinators on a farm is to reduce tillage. This is a system that my husband created one year, which was he knew he was going to put in a bunch of squash the next year. So in the fall, you can see in the upper left, October 2019, he planted a mix of winter rye in the alleys and then a radish that will winter kill on these rows where he intended to plant squash next year. This is all kind of to support soil health and potentially nesting opportunities for squash bees. So then the following year, you can see June 4th, 2020, he mowed down that really tall overwintered rye, and it turned into kind of this straw in situ kind of straw mulch. And then 5 days later, at the top right, they went through and added just a small line of compost. And then a couple days later, added in the squash plants. And you had all this covered soil, adding organic matter, and life to the soil. I don't know. I'll keep going. Protecting nest sites can look like a lot of different things. Protecting undisturbed soil, protecting margins of fields where there might be nests. There might be protecting rock piles or brush or different things. I even had a picture of like a sparrow nest or a grassland nesting bird. Those kinds of nests often get reused by rodents the next year. The year after that, they get used by bumblebees. So all these kinds of nests on the farm can be important for wildlife, especially bees. Insects need food. So remember, pesticide protection, nesting, they also need food. They need food throughout the growing season. That can be wildflowers and crops. Some bees need food throughout the entire season, like these general, like the honeybee or bumblebees. Some of them need really specialized windows of food foraging periods. When I advise people on designing seed mixes or really any kind of habitat, I'm often advocating for like this high diversity mix, not just in species richness, but plant family richness as well, because you can bring in all these different kinds of insects that really depend on that particular plant family. I always highlight some of the top workhorse plant families, like the asters, legumes, and willows, but I also highlight this little genus Lysimachia, native loosestripes, that hosts this really sort of rare oil collecting bee called Macropus that depends on these flowers to collect oil from these flowers to line their nest cells. If we don't add those kinds of plants into the landscape, we don't invite those pollinators into our landscape. But I would just add that, we could be doing this with crops as well. We could be adding crop diversity to the landscape to benefit us, to benefit these different pollinators. Crop diversity can bring in a lot of different pollinator specialists as well. These are common crop plant families up above, but I, encourage you to think about maybe we could also start using other kinds of crops that would bring in different kinds of pollinators and diversify our pollinator community, diversify our diets, diversify our landscapes. All right, annual farm habitat. I already kind of emphasized that I'm going to go from annual to perennial on all these. Annual habitat matters, right? It's not, we put a lot of emphasis on perennial habitat that because it's protected for multiple years at a time, but annual habitat is not trivial. It can provide a lot of pulses of resources for pollinators and other wildlife. And in that, I would also think about our crops. I look at a picture like this on the right, and I think about all the bees that are growing on strawberry pollen. Okay, annual habitat can be, you can create habitat with short windows of cover crops that are flowering. You can do this on a small scale in a garden, in between rotations of different crops, or on a large scale. Here are just a couple of guides that Xerces has to help you think through the decisions around that. I will say what I'm showing here is a lot of buckwheat. Buckwheat is by far one of the most attractive, not only for pollinators, but also for many, many other beneficial insects. And then there's also a lot of perennial habitat benefits where possible to integrate this more permanent type of habitat onto the farm. Strips can be one important thing as long as it's got adequate pesticide protection on the edges. They can be important habitat during the growing season, but also overwintering. This is an example of a prairie strip that many prairie strips that were implemented with a farm partner of ours in Montana, where it's more arid and they actually really want a lot of moisture to stay on the crop fields. And what I love about this image is that they curated all these annotations themselves, seeing that we put in these strips for the pollinators, which they highlight by this little arrow, biodiversity pointing to the pollinator up in the sky. But they also saw all these other benefits from it. It can look like beetle banks. This is basically a strip of, of grasses or sedges, a refuge for beetles, predaceous beetles, to disperse into a crop field and then retreat back into a protected nesting site. Oh, we have a guide on that as well. If you know anything about Xerces, you're picking up. We have a guide on all the habitat techniques. Uh, Perennial habitat through flowering hedgerows, flowering shrubs, things that can also provide us with fruits, like elderberries shown here, can do the dual purpose of creating forage and nesting sites. Of course, that creates berries for us, berries for other beloved creatures on our farms. We can be adding habitat in between crop fields, in places that we travel. All the sites can be pollinated habitat. The places where we have our livestock and our animals, it can be pollinator habitat if we allow spaces for them to flower before they get grazed down. Woody fields. This is on the far left is an orchard understory. So it's an apple orchard in full bloom with a native understory. It's beautiful, blurry in this image here. Oak savannas can be important. Grazing systems can be important. I'm here to tell you that all land is pollinator habitat. It just differs in how you pull it off. Rangeland, native grasslands are vital pollinator habitat. Some of my coworkers are doing really interesting stuff in the range states on the value of different forbs for pollinators and for livestock. My coworker in Wisconsin, Micah, is doing really great work becoming a local expert on how to graze native prairies. So grazing systems are great pollinator habitat. Wetlands can be great pollinator habitat. Here's a little anecdote of a of a species that is sort of a wetland specialist, Megachile addenda. This is a species that's a pretty important cranberry pollinator in some parts of the country, kind of widespread distribution, as you can see on the left. It commonly nests in areas that are flooded. It can nest under it can survive 4 months of 1 meter of water flooding. So that's an adaptation that's beautiful and you know stunning. The even cooler part of the story is that this bee, Megachile, has a kleptoparasite that it has sort of co-evolved with called Celiaxis that this is a bee that doesn't actually forage any of her own resources. She just finds one of these Megachile nests, terminates or kills the young that are growing on the pollen that she's collected, and then she lays her own eggs in that nest. So, what's implied here is that she's also surviving these flooding conditions. Okay, so wetlands are cool. Urban sites are really important. And I don't probably have enough slides in here about urban habitat, but I just think that this is a frontier that we need to be imagining a lot. Right here on the left, I have this picture of this community garden habitat site in North Minneapolis. On the right is a picture from one of my colleagues, Cass, up in Philadelphia, where they depaved a parking lot in a high school. And they planted native habitat. They also planted some food crops. And it's really novel and experimental and what we need more of in the future. The last few years, USDA has really supported this community agriculture and urban ag initiative called the People's Garden Initiative. There are gardens now registered all over the country. And what's valuable about this is not that it's creating so much food, but that there's this network where people are learning about agriculture. They're getting their hands dirty. They're creating systems for youth mentorship around food production. They're learning about the habitat that supports agriculture in urban areas. I have had the great privilege of working with Elder Michael Cheney in North Minneapolis, shown here, the director of Project Sweetie Pie. On the lower right here, you can see some of the garden that I've been working with him on. If you are not familiar with Michael Cheney, he's just one of many amazing leaders in the metro area who's really trying to make Minnesota a space where urban areas are green. We have vocational opportunities for youth to get into agriculture, learn about it. I think we're going to need a lot more of this kind of thing with the climate that we're headed in. Where else do we have? These are some of the activities we did in the garden, learning about pollinators, not just the habitat plants that we put in, but also you can see my fingers here. Picture where I was demonstrating kind of the pollinating parts or the sexual parts of a pepper flower and how that might interact with, how the pollinators might manipulate that and create the fruit. This is also this space for pollination, right? This of policy ideas where we could talk to representatives and talk about Farm Bill policy. So these are really important spaces, disproportionate. They're maybe not making as much food impact, but they are having real meaningful impacts for these diverse solutions that we need on the farm in a changing climate. I'm pushing the envelope here. Another idea is that we could be gathering, pushing the boundaries of like what is food, foraging for pollinator conservation, maybe a new idea to some, maybe an ancient idea to others here. But here we are at a foraging session led by a couple sort of famous in the world of foraging leaders. This is Sam Thayer talking about how important milkweed is for foraging, and how if we all were foraging more on our milkweeds, we could really be saving monarchs, because when you forage milkweed, you stimulate the plant to create new growth, and that new growth is what monarchs prefer to lay their eggs on. And so his proposition is that if we all were tending milkweed vegetable gardens, we would all be contributing to monarch conservation. And what I'm highlighting here, that this is at a pollinator festival led by Wakantipi Awayankapi, a native-led group in the metro area that puts on this pollinator festival every year. I really love how they're bringing in these different plant knowledges and pollinator conservation together. And I will just say that this idea of eating milkweed is not new. My former colleague, Eric Lemater, wrote about this in his most recent book, The Milkweed Lands, where he featured this publication from George Washington Carver, where George Washington Carver was suggesting the need to eat our weeds to save cultivated vegetables for overseas fighting forces during World War II. So there's this idea that we could be seeing more food in the landscape and potentially benefiting pollinators in the process. However, if you still want to get your food from the grocery store rather than your local park, there are still ways to support pollinator conservation, and Xerces has been working that channel as well. We have, in the last few years, been working on this program called Be Better Certified, where we work with farmers and food companies to make meaningful impacts on large farms, think like California orchards, to make meaningful pollinator conservation strides and give those companies some credit for doing it, and provide something that consumers can vote for. There's a lot of partners behind this growing label. Xerces, Oregon Tilth, and NRCS are the key partners, but a lot of different companies have gotten on board. You can already start to see some of these labels in different major grocery chains, like I don't shop at those places, like Sam's Club, like the Costco, those places. But the cool thing about this certification is not just it's meaningful, and that it's third-party certified, and it's rigorous. If you look at the standards for pesticide protection and so forth, it's not easy to get certified. So it is something that you can shop for in the grocery store and still be supporting pollinator conservation and agroecosystems. These are just some of the standards. We talk about creating habitat, reducing pesticide risk, creating nest sites, and supporting bumblebees. It's science-based, it's farm level certification. I'm breezing through this because I know I'm going long. Uh, and you can go find this stuff and realize that you are supporting change in the agroecosystem kind of industry. All right. I am not going to spend a bunch of time on this. I'm going to breeze through it really quickly, but on a talk about climate change and pollinators, I cannot not mention one of my favorite farmers, which is Kurt Kimber and his family, Chris Kimber and their family. So this is Kurt and Chris. They live in Dakota County. Kurt describes himself as a serial activist working to create, meaningful changes in agriculture, growing real food. They're certified organic. They have meaningfully put in biodiversity practices throughout the farm. I started working with them in 2017, and their farm looked something like this, where there was almost no biodiversity on the farm, very little. For pollinators, we figured out what was missing, which is everything, and decided what to do to change it. So in 2019, he worked with the local conservation district and me. We designed these contour buffer strips to create like prairie habitat integrated throughout the farm. He also experimented with a lot of Kernza plantings, which is a perennial wheatgrass, kind of similar to wheat as a substitute. And we did various things here. In 2 years later, so this is a second growing season, you could already see the impact on the land. This is June 2021 from above. This is June 2021 kind of from a drone angle. You can see the changes happening. He did this because there's a slight enough slope that in these 2-inch plus rainfall events, he was worried about his erosion and losing his soil. In that same year, 2021, when it's all flowering, he invited all these different agency partners out to celebrate Pollinator Week. In 2022, we did a field day talking about the importance of regenerative crops like Kernza, and we also talked about prairie strips there. And the reason I'm featuring Kurt in these is because he has these pithy kind of sayings that are so helpful for thinking about changes and the changes ahead. He says, this is how he ended the field day. We live in a paradise. Let's just hope we can hold on to it. Right. This is during a day when there were just swallows swooping through this field, presumably eating bugs. In 2024, just a few months ago, we did another field day, this time with a whole busload of folks from General Mills. And they wanted to see what biodiversity and regenerative farming looks like. And this is what he said to this group. We should be acting like our house is on fire, and I'm just trying to do what I can from where I stand. I encourage all of you to be thinking about what you can do too. And so I just love that there are these change makers out there. And one of the great joys of my job is that I get to lift up these different farmers doing cool stuff. Okay, I know that you all have lots of questions, so I'm going to just launch here into ways that you can learn more. One great resource every year, hosted by the Pollinator Friendly Alliance, is this 3-day virtual summit, where every year they bring in the most kind of advanced, forward-thinking people to talk about different pollinator research, how we can be involved in creating high-quality habitat for them. So go register and participate in that. Xerces has tons of resources. This is just the tip of the iceberg on what resources we have. We're on many of the social media channels, and we have a podcast. Oh, I went through that too fast. We have many supporters, many supporters. Some of you might be in the audience who are supporters. Thank you for the work that you're doing to help support all of our work. And then I'll just leave it there. And then, sorry, I didn't leave a ton of time, but you all can reach out to me later with direct questions.
What
Should I
a
stop
fabulous.
sharing?
Oh, what was that, Karen?
Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, if you want to, yeah.
Okay.
Then people can see. see us a little bit better. What a fabulous presentation. I I'm astounded. It is so interesting to see that we are such a small percentage of life on Earth, but we make such a large impact. And you also have a ton of resources to share with the audience. So just a reminder, we'll be sending those out in the resource email as well on Friday. Oh, am I frozen? I hope I'm not frozen.
We can hear you,
We
but
can
your
hear you.
video is
Okay,
frozen.
perfect. Okay, things are not responding on my end. So I'm hoping this doesn't go down with all the tabs that I have open because we have lots of questions for you, Karin. So let's start off with, you were talking about super pollinator plants with your hot pepper uh, example. Do you know, is any good resources to selecting these super pollinator plants? Any good
Mm.
indexes? Anything you know of?
Well, it depends on if you're thinking about, there's lots of lists that are like native plant lists. Xerces has many for different regions. We have a Great Lakes, we have Northern Great Plains. Those are the two that kind of cover Minnesota. It's 50 plants, native plants, that are kind of selected as workhorse species that really bring in a whole bunch of different pollinators, generalists, specialists. So there's like a lot of native plants. There's a lot of, I don't know, a lot of crop plants don't get listed by like how important they are for pollinators, but I'm just here to say that there's a lot of plants that, that are crop plants that are really appreciated by pollinators. And I don't know of any lists that are designed that way. And certainly none that really integrate them. Actually, I would say one thing. We a Xerces resource. It's called the Urban Habitat Assessment Guide. Um, I can't multitask fast enough to share that in the chat. But on that guide, there's a kind of a cheat sheet of cultivated tame plants that we might use for herbs or for crop plants that are really important for pollinators, and then coupled with some native plants. That's one place I know would be a great checklist resource. I'm worried that Tara's frozen because I can't hear you.
Yeah, I suspect so as well. So I can feed you some of the questions though, Karin. So there was a question about, do you have information on the impact of chloride pollution on pollinators?
I don't. Generally that kind of thing, I lean on my pesticide reduction team to kind of like think about all things contaminants. I also know that Emily Snell-Rude is pretty involved in some research on kind of like salt contaminants of roadside habitat. I'm not that well versed in her research, but some of you from the University of Minnesota can correct me. But I think that might be a good place to start. I don't have great answer to that question, I'm afraid.
Thank you. No, we can see if we can find some resources on that too for our follow-up email. But Elaine, did you happen to have any information or knowledge on the chloride side?
I do not.
Okay, just thought I'd ask. And then Karin, somebody asked, how can you tell whether a plant you buy has been treated with neonicotinoids? Must a nursery let the customer know?
Yeah, often it's not that obvious. I mean, that's one of the insidious things about pesticides is that you can't always see that they're there, and often an indication that they might be there is that the plant looks really nice. It doesn't have any herbivory or anything on it. So I think Xerces has developed a lot of resources for both parties in this nursery conversation because there's a lot of factors that drive nurseries to use materials that have different treatments. So there's best practices for like what a nursery might need, then there's questions and things that like a consumer might bring to the conversation. It's really just a matter of, look at the Xerces website to see kind of what are the questions that you might bring to a nursery. And then also think about like their side of things and why they might be using certain materials. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is like consumers driving the choices that we see in the market and just asking directly those questions to the nurseries.
Thanks. I think this next question kind of ties into that is a question on if plants in our yards contain neonics or some other systemic pesticide, does it decline over time? And then there's kind of a question about maybe how quickly that might happen. But I suspect that's part of the conversation with the nursery too, to a degree.
Yeah, I don't have the results on the tip of my tongue, but I know that some people on our pollinator team, as well as our pesticide reduction team, have been working really closely to think about, just testing like milkweed samples from different retailers around the country and finding what are the contaminants that we find on milkweeds and then how slowly, like fast or slowly they break down. I'm sure that some of that work is published. I just don't know the results at the tip of my tongue.
No, thank you. Here's a couple for you specifically is regarding your own farm. 2 questions. This person was curious if you plant any GMO seed and maybe if you can speak to that. And then what pesticides or herbicides do you use or I'd say the flip side could be maybe do you not use?
GMO seed, we do not plant any. We're a certified organic farm. We used to plant up to 14 acres of vegetables, and now we do not. We have a couple of acres, and those are largely grown from a renter, but he also grows certified organic. That's not to say that we've never used pesticides. There are certified organic products that generally break down really quickly. They're made of naturally occurring substances, and not synthetic things like BT on broccoli, or generally not that many things. I mean, we rely on, for better or for worse, like a lot of cultivation for weed management, and that comes with other kinds of soil health consequences, but we don't use a lot of pesticides on the farm. I will say there is one exception that in our work to protect, to like restore oak savanna in parts of the farm that are much kind of further away, and that we're really, really trying to be aggressive on working on buckthorn. There are times when we have used some spot treatment of garlan on invasive species, like far from crops, and then followed it with subsequent years with grazing or fire management. So using it in combination with other more organic approaches.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for answering that. I'm trying to distill some of the questions that are still hanging out there just a little bit.
I think, Claire, before you do that, I think I'm going to
Thank you.
launch the poll.
Yep.
Thank you so much for recovering. I'm so glad. Love my team. You could see they just jumped right in. Just thank you so much. So I'm back on. I can't see any of the Q&As, but before we get to any more questions, I do want to launch the poll for Karin. And yeah, just while everyone's filling that out, we really appreciate your input. And obviously, you could tell just how grateful we are and appreciative we are of Karin and her fabulous presentation. So thank you for these responses, and we really appreciate the feedback. So Claire, would you be able to go back to the questions? I don't see any, unfortunately.
Oh, yep. Yep, I'm glad you launched the poll. And yes, there have been lots of comments. Karin, thanking you for your presentation and complimenting what a great wealth of information it was. So thank you. But yeah, there's one question that kind of states that that they've noticed an increased number of services kind of door knocking and coming around, to homes claiming to rid yards of mosquitoes, ants, spiders in kind of urban neighborhoods. And this person specifically is in East St. Paul. And they're kind of less interested in trying to convince neighbors not to use those companies than in really like asking cities to prevent those services from operating. So that's kind of that question leads into asking, are there any examples of that, or do you have any references where that's happened, or maybe you're aware of something that Xerces has been involved in, or
Yeah, I guess what I would say is Xerces is quite involved in this kind of stuff. Our pesticide reduction team is very involved in supporting municipalities through better pest management practices and creating literature to support them, and also to support residents in helping to understand what the impacts might be. I think there's more research to do. I am not in those immediate circles within Xerces. I'm not that fluent in kind of how to approach those conversations. However, I'm just one click away from getting really good quality answers to you if you want to send me a direct email about that, because there are people working on this in Xerces, and not all of it probably is browsable on our website yet. Like, I think there's emerging research and publications and conversations and guidance that's being developed right now.
Thank you. That's good to know, and good to know that you're available, and maybe you can throw your email in the chat, even though I'm sure Tara will share that at the end of the series as well. So I think maybe we have time for this one last question is what support, if any, in terms of forage, shelter, etc., does a large like monoculture field of corn or soybeans or wheat provide to pollinators or other insects? And I have some thoughts on this too.
I know,
Karen,
I kind of want you to answer this. Do you want to take it?
Sure, yeah.
Great.
So I work with row crop systems and have an interest and background in entomology, and so yeah, I'd say I can speak more to the other insects part of this question. Is some of our beneficial insects like ground beetles or things that live in or on the soil, particularly can find some shelter in our row crop fields. When there is cover really present, we do see predation happening. We see those predators or things that kind of eat our ground dwelling pest insects present. So in corn systems, I'd say that happens most often when there's cover crops in a cornfield, or if there's corn residue left on the field, there can be shelter for those ground dwelling insects that way. Soybeans, when there's canopy closure especially, I think is when we see those ground dwelling insects out there. And then wheat, again, I'm not as familiar with wheat systems, but I'd say when we see it as a cover crop or we see it left out there as residue, would be when we would see at least some of those ground dwelling insects. As far as pollinators, things that are like alfalfa and soybeans, and again, soybeans are self-pollinating. They don't need pollinator insects, but sometimes pollinator insects do forage out in fields with those flowering plants like alfalfa and soybean. And Elaine might have some to add as well, because she's been working in some of those systems.
I was answering other questions, so I'm not
Oh,
sure what the question is. I was looking at the Q&A.
Just no, kind of what support, if any, in terms of like forage and shelter do like fields of corn, soybean, wheat provide for pollinators? I kind of touched on ground beetles and kind of the shelter perspective, but if you had anything to add on foraging for our pollinator insects, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there ends up, so actually a lot of my PhD research was in agricultural, in kind of the ditches around agricultural fields, around a lot of corn and soy. And there is definitely, there are, depending on the area, there can be pockets of nesting areas, especially if there are, kind of untilled corners. A lot of the ground nesting bees can do pretty well at finding and using those habitats. Some bees do better than others, so it's kind of a little bit of a filter. There's a lot of different bees that we see pretty commonly in agricultural areas because they are able to find those places to nest. I mentioned in the Q&A, people asking about corn. Bees will sometimes collect pollen from corn. It doesn't make any nectar. They can get a little bit. And I know you were writing about soy too. They will sometimes use that, but depending on what the system is like, if there are just those kind of corners, even just, it's great if they're planted with native plants, but even just the kind of agricultural weeds, there's a lot of bees that will find their way to that and will be able to do pretty well. And there's, it's best to get plants that they really love there, but these agricultural areas, there are a lot of cool, diverse bees that are still kind of hanging on and are in those areas. It's only been relatively, like 100, 150 years, not that long in terms of how long these things have been on the landscape. So these agricultural areas can still be really important. There are bees still out there hanging on by a thread, and getting more resources there for them is really important.
Thanks, Elaine. Yeah, anything to add to that, Karin? Otherwise, we made it through all of the Q&A questions. Tara, if you had anything to
I don't have
add or
anything
summarize.
to add. I'm trying to read through the questions that are coming in. So I apologize for being distracted.
No, that was the one thing that I could see while everything was shutting down were all the emojis and all the chats still popping up about how good you were doing. So that's all I could see for that brief moment in time. So thank you again. Thank you for your patience, everyone. But thank you, Karin. Really, I mean, it's you did a fantastic job at really immersing us into your world, and you have an awesome job.
I know, it's a dream job. But I also am aware that I live in this bubble of the way I see the world, and so sometimes I wonder why I get this platform and I'm like showing this tiny bubble of a world that I live, and I don't know if it lands with the people who have like different lives. But yeah.
We appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you for all the great questions. And this concludes the second session of our climate resilient pollinator habitats across Minnesota landscapes. And hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow for the next presentation on key steps for successful residential pollinator plantings with Dan Shaw and Aaron Loeffner. Now, take care, everyone.